If you were to become a doctor, you would swear something called the Hippocratic Oath. And among other things, there's a whole list, but among other things, you swear to do no harm. What about a Hippocratic Oath for financial advisors? Our next guest argues that this could make a huge difference both for the advisors and for the clients that they serve. John Goey is a portfolio manager and author at Designed Securities, and he joins us now to talk about it. Hello there.
Hi.
So when you think about the Hippocratic Oath, and many of us would be familiar of what that is from a medical context, why do you think it could be a fit in the world of financial services?
Well, it could be a fit in any profession. A lot of professions have an obligation to serve the public in a way that is what's best for the client, for the people they're serving. And the problem that we have in the financial services industry is that it has evolved out of a culture of sales. And as a result, doing what will get you the sale and get the assets under management is not necessarily what's always best for the client. So the idea is to try to find a way to do some jujitsu to put the ball back in the court where the obligation is to do what's right for the person actually getting the advice as opposed to what's profitable for the people giving it. And that's why you want to do it. You want to turn the tables.
Now, when we use the phrase financial advisors, that is pretty all encompassing. And there's a lot of discussion about who can use that phrase and who can't, and designations and all those sorts of things. What are some of the elements that you think a Hippocratic Oath at its best could capture? So parking aside the designations for a second, what would you want it to capture?
The first thing with any kind of an oath of this nature is that you have to do what is best for the person you're giving advice to. So if you can't be held to what is a fiduciary standard, you need to at least be able to commit to something like that. And that is to put the interests of the client first. So that's by far the number one thing. Then beyond that, you want to look at other elements of professionalism. So maybe not a Hippocratic Oath so much, but you might want to have a best practices, a fee schedule, a commitment to trying to keep your costs down, all the other things that are part and parcel with what's best for the client, even if it's not clearly codified.
Mm. Now, there is a lot of gray here, and I can think of two examples that would be kind of problematic. The first one would be asset allocation. The second one would be fees. I'm sure there's many others, but let's talk about asset allocation for a second. So you've got a single person who is working a job, they've got a kid, they have no pension, but they love the stock market, and they're working with their financial advisor to trade and take advantage of trends and try and outperform the benchmark and all those sorts of things. Awesome, except that many would argue that given the demographics that I just outlined, something a bit more conservative would be appropriate, some fixed income and all that. How do you square that circle?
These days is now being looked at from the perspective of risk tolerance and risk capacity. So regulators, in terms of how they focus on helping the advisor to do what is right for the client, they require that you look at the client's risk tolerance and risk capacity. So even if that person wants to be in an all equity portfolio, it would be hard to justify doing that, recommending that, given the tolerance and capacity. Most likely the actual capacity for a person like that to be able to sustain that.
The second one I highlighted is fees, and
Yeah.
you've talked a lot about that. I've certainly talked a lot about that. If we look at the continuum, there would be high fees and great service in which every single penny is worth it. And then there's high fees in which there is limited value to the fees. How would you, in the context of a Hippocratic Oath, determine what's best? Because those who are charging the fees would say, listen, I'm actually getting better outcomes because I'm supporting the client to take actions that they otherwise would not.
Part of what you have to do as an advisor now is you have to actually do some due diligence with regard to what products you're recommending, why, and also what products you could have recommended that are suitable alternatives. So you need to be able to justify that if you're using a product that has a higher fee, how is that better for the client? And I'm with you. I think it's highly questionable that a higher fee product will be better, all else being equal. There might be something, and I'm not going to quibble over 10 or 20 basis points, but if it's 50, 60, 70, 80 basis points, I'm going to have a hard time justifying the higher cost product. And what that does ultimately is puts ever so slowly, the industry is moving toward being more professional, being more evidence-based, and moving toward those things that are cheaper and hopefully better for the client.
In your view, would this Hippocratic oath live in the land of regulation or would it live in the land of principle? And I ask because there's already so much regulation
Right.
in this space.
In my world, I would be happy with either. As far as I'm concerned, either is better than nothing. And the problem with any kind of a Hippocratic oath is that it's somewhat trying to impose a morality on the way the
Mm.
practitioners do things. And you can't really impose morality. So whether it's done through regulation or through some sort of a moral suasion, it's the sort of thing where I think it will move the ball forward, but I don't want to overstate the benefit. I think there are going to be bad apples. There are bad doctors, even though there is a Hippocratic
Yeah.
oath. So it helps, but it doesn't solve everything.
I referenced the number of different designations out there. It feels like, I mean, it's not infinite, but sometimes it can feel like that.
Yeah.
Is there a concern that introducing something like the Hippocratic Oath would make it even more consuming for, or confusing rather, even more confusing for clients?
I think the answer to that is no. If anybody who gives advice, anybody who has a license to sell investment products or to give investment advice to the clients is obligated to take a Hippocratic oath, then it will be the sort of thing that ideally you'd want it to be for 100% of the people giving advice. And it's not another thing that will confuse people. It'll just be another tick box that you have to be able to check in order to be able to hold out your shingle and do your job.
When we think about doctors, the behaviors that they could take on that would do harm, over prescribing, not paying attention to symptoms, not providing a physical examination. There are lots of things that you could say would be inconsistent with that oath. What are some things that you would say some financial advisors might be doing, behaviors they might be acting on that would be inconsistent with a Hippocratic oath?
Anything that is, if people are not keeping up with regard to research, and you know this with accountants that don't keep track with regard to their tax filings and changes to the law and so forth. In finance, there are a lot of things that have been proven empirically that for some reason financial advisors are not always aware of. So one thing, there was a paper that came out in 2016 called The Misguided Beliefs of Financial Advisors. And it showed that Canadian MFDA, this is now mutual fund registrants, not necessarily everyone, but that's the majority of people who give advice in Canada use mutual funds, chase past performance, are indifferent to product cost, and run concentrated positions. Now, these are all three things that have been shown 5 ways to Friday as being harmful for investors. And yet advisors do this. And the research shows that they do this even in their own accounts, even after they retire, because it's not a question of misplaced agency or looking for a commission. The problem is these advisors actually believe things that are false. So that's a real problem. We have to go out of our way to disabuse advisors from false beliefs that they have somehow accumulated over the years.
It's interesting because it reminds me of what the medical community believed back in ancient, not even ancient, probably medieval times, about the efficacy of bleeding patients. I bet there are things that a couple of decades from now, we might say, that wasn't such a great idea, was it?
It's a question of how quickly you can adapt to new information when the evidence comes forward. So the example that I like to use is in 1964, the US Surgeon General came out with a report showing that cigarettes cause cancer. And within a matter of a decade or two, it was the sort of thing that it was on the cigarette packaging and it became in your face. And despite that, when the evidence came forward in the mid 60s, there were more American doctors as a percentage of the general population that were smoking than there were ordinary citizens, which is to say doctors were more likely to smoke than a non-doctor.
Right.
So you can imagine the cognitive dissonance that the industry had to deal with, because here are people who have quite literally, in the case of the doctors, sworn a Hippocratic oath, and they were themselves culpable of not only not just abusing their clients and their patients of harmful things, but actually engaging in that harmful activity themselves, which is a bit hypocritical. Now, you might want to call it the hypocritical.
Right. John, as always, we can rely on you for a contrarian opinion and insight into all matters related to investing in personal finance. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure, Bruce. Thank you.
John Goey is with Designed Securities, and he was here to talk about his idea for the launch of a kind of Hippocratic oath for financial advisors.